There are seasons in a person's life when the soul becomes aware of the weight it has been carrying, not through catastrophe, but through a quiet, undeniable inner stirring. Something inside begins to whisper that you were not meant to live drowning in noise, suffocating under desires that are not your own, or bound to habits that shrink your spirit. And it is in these seasons when you suddenly feel the ache of what could be and the fatigue of what has been that the ancient practice of fasting reveals itself not as religious ritual, but as spiritual intelligence, not as starvation of the body, but as nourishment of the soul, not as punishment, but as liberation. For there are strongholds hidden, subtle, deeply woven into the architecture of your inner world that cannot be shattered by willpower alone. Strongholds built not of demons with horns, but of demons with names like fear, comparison, resentment, greed, restlessness, ego, self-doubt, strongholds that whisper to you when you are tired, that pull at your attention when you are lonely, that shape your decisions when you are afraid. These are not creatures of mythology, they are structures of thought, patterns of desire, reflexes of weakness, entire ecosystems of craving and avoidance that can imprison a soul for a lifetime if never confronted. And yet these structures crumble not under brute force, but under fasting. But fasting in its truest sense is not the abstaining from food. It is the abstaining from the forces that feed your downfall. It is the deliberate, courageous refusal to nourish what is trying to control you. It is a spiritual strike, a protest of the soul, a declaration that says, I will no longer feed what is killing me, for whatever you starve grows weak, and whatever you feed grows power. So fasting becomes the art of starving the darkness within you, piece by piece, breath by breath, moment by moment, until the darkness loses its vocabulary. It begins quietly, always quietly. The greatest transformations rarely start with earthquakes, but with whispers. A whisper that says your relationship with wealth must be redefined, that your hunger for validation must be surrendered, that your addiction to distraction must be severed, that your need to react, to rush, to prove, to compare must be put to rest. And as you listen, something inside you straightens, your posture shifts, your spirit becomes alert, and you realize that this kind of fasting is not about abstaining from bread, but abstaining from bondage. For the first stronghold always falls when you refuse to feed what once fed on you. And so fasting becomes more than discipline. It becomes defiance. It becomes a tearing down of inner empires built on fear, a cleansing of the atmosphere around your thoughts, a purifying fire that sweeps through the halls of your identity, revealing how much of you was shaped not by truth but by habit, not by purpose but by pressure, not by calling but by culture. Every meaningful life must eventually confront this truth. What you do not fast from, you will eventually serve, and what you repeatedly serve becomes your master. This is why strongholds are not broken by emotion, nor by inspiration, nor by sudden bursts of motivation. Strongholds crumble under consistency, under clarity, under the long obedience of fasting from what weakens you, from what distracts you, from what dilutes you. This is the first great paradox the soul must understand. Fasting is not deprivation. It is reclamation. As you fast from noise, from ego, from destructive impulses, you begin to notice the outlines of your true self emerging from beneath the rubble of your old patterns. You feel the architecture of your spirit realigning, piece by piece, toward a version of yourself that is not ruled by craving, but guided by conviction. And as this realignment deepens, a second transformation begins. Your relationship with wealth shifts. Wealth ceases to be merely numerical. It becomes spiritual. It becomes the richness of clarity, the abundance of discipline, the prosperity of self-governance, the luxury of peace. For what is the point of accumulating treasures if the soul holding them is bankrupt? What is the worth of success if you are its prisoner? What is the meaning of abundance when the inner world is hollow? This is why fasting tears down what ordinary effort cannot touch, because it does not target the symptoms of your bondage, but the root system. You begin to see greed not as financial desire, but as spiritual hunger misplaced. You see pride not as confidence, but as fear wearing a mask. You see addiction not as weakness, but as a longing for connection that was never fulfilled. You see comparison not as insecurity, but as the soul forgetting its own worth. You see distraction not as laziness, but as the fear of facing yourself. And the more clearly you see, the more necessary fasting becomes not to punish yourself, but to tell the truth about yourself. For there is no demon stronger than denial, and there is no stronghold more fortified than the one you've learned to live comfortably inside. But fasting cracks the walls. Fasting exposes the lies. Fasting loosens the chains. Fasting frees the imagination. Fasting trains the will. Fasting wakes the spirit. For strongholds collapse not when the world changes, but when the heart becomes spacious enough for truth to reign. And in this spaciousness, a new life begins, one not built on impulse but intention, not on craving but calling, not on fear but freedom. And as this freedom begins to take shape within you, you notice something subtle but unmistakable. The soul becomes quieter, not empty, not numb, not hollow, but quiet in the way a mountain is quiet, or the ocean at dawn, or a cathedral no longer echoing with restless footsteps. It is the quiet of a life no longer ruled by cravings, the quiet of desires that have been purified through fasting, the quiet of strength that no longer needs to prove itself, the quiet of purpose that no longer needs applause to feel real. This quiet is not an escape from life, but the grounding necessary to live it fully. For in this quiet, you begin to hear what you had forgotten to listen for, your own soul. Its voice is softer than fear, quieter than ego, gentler than desire, and that is why you never heard it while the noise ruled your world. For through fasting, through the refusal to feed what shackled you, the soul's voice becomes unmistakable. It does not shout, it does not demand, it invites, it beckons. It asks the question that every stronghold fears you will hear. Who could you become if nothing inside you resisted your transformation? This is the question that tears down the second stronghold, the stronghold of identity shaped by old stories. So much of your bondage survives because you have unknowingly fasted from truth and feasted on narratives that shrink you. Narratives inherited from childhood, from wounds, from past failures, from careless words spoken over you, from years of settling for less than what your soul was built to hold. These stories cling to you because they are familiar. They feel like home even when they suffocate you. But fasting, true fasting, severs the emotional umbilical cord between you and the lies you once called identity. You begin fasting from the belief that you are your past, fasting from the belief that you are your mistakes, fasting from the belief that you are not enough, fasting from the belief that your worth must be earned, fasting from the belief that you must stay small to be loved. And as these beliefs weaken, starved by your discipline, deprived of your agreement, a truer identity begins to grow inside the space they once occupied. You feel yourself becoming someone with a moral center, someone whose worth is not fragile, someone who no longer needs external validation to justify internal truth. The soul awakens into fullness, not because fasting gave it new power, but because it removed everything that once eclipsed the power you already carried. This awakening is the beginning of the third fasting practice, fasting from the illusions that modern life calls reality. For the world is full of illusions, intricate enough to pass for purpose. People chase careers that feed their pride but starve their spirit. They pursue wealth that enriches their image but impoverishes their peace. They chase relationships that gratify their loneliness but injure their integrity. They cling to routines that numb today but mortgage tomorrow. The world rewards performance but neglects authenticity, celebrates excess but ignores depth, praises visibility but dismisses substance. And so fasting becomes an act of rebellion, a refusal to build your life on illusions, a refusal to measure yourself by crowds or metrics or fleeting approval. a refusal to let culture define what success should feel like in your chest. When you fast from illusions, you stop feeding the self that performs and start feeding the self that is. You stop living for applause and start living for alignment. You stop sprinting for recognition and start walking with purpose. You stop devouring the shallow and begin savoring the real. And once this shift takes hold, you begin to see that the strongholds you once feared were not walls around you, they were walls within you. Walls held together by habits, walls strengthened by repetition, walls built out of the bricks of emotional avoidance. These walls fall not through violence, but through fasting, because fasting deprives them of the nourishment of your attention. Attention is the currency of your inner world. What you give attention to, you grant authority over you. This is the fourth fasting practice, fasting from misplaced attention. Attention is not merely focus, it is devotion. Whatever receives your attention receives your energy. Whatever receives your energy receives your life. And when you begin fasting from distractions, from negativity, from bitterness, from assumptions, from every mental parasite that drains your clarity, something miraculous happens. Your life becomes whole again. For so many spiritual strongholds thrive not because they are powerful, but because your attention is fragmented. You are pulled in too many directions at once, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and the fragmentation becomes fertile ground for every inner enemy. Fear thrives where attention is scattered. Temptation thrives where attention is unstable. Weak habits thrive where attention is undisciplined. The true stronghold was never darkness's presence. It was your belief that the darkness had power. It fed on your fear, but fasting starved the fear. It fed on your distraction, but fasting starved the noise. It fed on your insecurities, but fasting starved the lies. It fed on your cravings, but fasting starved the hunger that once ruled you. And as the strongholds crack, you notice that the real victory is not the fall of the walls, it is the rise of the self that no longer needs them. You begin walking with a steadiness that does not wobble in storms, a humility that does not seek to be hidden, nor to be elevated, but simply to be true, a confidence that is not loud, but rooted, a peace that does not fluctuate with circumstance, a gratitude that colors the air around your life like sunlight filtering through stained glass. You begin to walk as someone who knows the truth, that abundance is not granted to the deserving, but to the prepared, not to the loud, but to the aligned, not to the fortunate, but to the faithful. And as your fasting becomes transformation, your transformation becomes atmosphere. You carry peace into chaotic spaces. You carry discipline into undisciplined cultures. You carry integrity into rooms built on pretense. You carry moral strength into systems rooted in compromise. You carry compassion into places governed by ego. Your presence becomes its own argument. And when your presence becomes an argument, strongholds collapse not because you attacked them, but because your very existence refuted them. You have become someone they cannot hold. And the more you walk in this strength, the more you begin to recognize how few people in the world ever taste this kind of freedom. Most people live their lives enslaved by impulses they never question, beliefs they never examine, wounds they never heal, and desires they never refine. They wake up every morning and call it normal because no one ever told them their soul was designed for more than survival. But fasting opens a door into a truth that few dare to enter. The greatest prison is the untransformed self, and the greatest liberation is the self that chooses to rise. For transformation is never accidental. No one drifts upward. No one stumbles into meaning. No one inherits character. No one becomes wise by accident or disciplined by coincidence or spiritually whole by luck. Every valuable life is sculpted, not stumbled into. Every strong soul is forged, not discovered. Every person who radiates integrity did not simply wake up that way. They fasted from the impulses that corrupted them. Every person who walks with clarity starved the distractions that once clouded them. Every person who carries peace starved the chaos that once ruled them. Every person who holds power without abusing it starved the ego that once demanded applause. This is why fasting is frightening to the old self, because the old self knows it cannot survive the discipline of the new one. Every time you fast, something dies. A habit, an addiction, a fear, an illusion, a false identity. And every time something dies, something truer is born. The soul feels this death and birth, simultaneously the ache of letting go, the freedom of becoming, the grief of releasing what no longer fits, the joy of discovering what finally does. This is the paradox of spiritual transformation. You mourn and rise in the same breath. As you continue fasting from the things that weaken your spirit, you notice that the world begins to react to your growth. Not always positively. In fact, growth often disturbs those who benefited from your weakness. People who were comfortable with your old patterns may feel threatened by your new strength. People who relied on your instability may feel unsettled by your clarity. People who manipulated your insecurities may panic when those insecurities weaken. People who lived comfortably with your silence may grow anxious when your voice returns. For your transformation exposes their stagnation, and stagnation resists exposure. You used to be predictable, manageable, easy to sway, easy to guilt, easy to silence. But now, fasting has awakened something sovereign in you. Something that knows how to say no without apology, how to set boundaries without guilt, how to walk away without bitterness, how to stay present without fear, how to choose what is right, even when what is easy smiles seductively at you. Strongholds collapse when you stop negotiating with what destroys you. And yet, the deepest strongholds are not external, they are internal. The strongholds built from your own desires. For desire, when undisciplined, can be a tyrant. The desire to be loved can make you betray your values. The desire to be admired can make you fake your identity. The desire to be successful can make you compromise your integrity. The desire to be safe can make you settle for a life that suffocates your purpose. The desire to avoid discomfort can make you run from the very process designed to grow you. But fasting trains desire to serve you rather than rule you. You begin fasting from the desire to be understood by everyone. Fasting from the desire to win every argument. Fasting from the desire to prove your worth. Fasting from the desire to avoid discomfort. Fasting from the desire to please those who do not value your growth. And as these desires loosen their grip, a new form of strength emerges. Not the strength of stubbornness, but the strength of clarity. You are no longer pulled by competing hungers. You move with intention, with alignment, with a quiet authority that cannot be imitated. This inner authority is what dismantles the stronghold of fear. For fear cannot survive in a disciplined soul. Fear feeds on scattered attention, but you have gathered your attention. Fear feeds on emotional impulsiveness, but you have learned to pause. Fear feeds on uncertainty, but fasting has taught you clarity. Fear feeds on chaos, but fasting has given you order. Fear feeds on illusion, but fasting has given you truth. Fear cannot manipulate a soul that is fully awake. This awakening gives birth to another transformation. Your understanding of time changes. Before, time felt overwhelming. Too fast, too slow, too scarce, too demanding. But fasting slows the soul enough for you to finally see that time is not the enemy, undisciplined desire is. Time was never the stronghold, your scattered focus was. When you fast from distractions, time multiplies. When you fast from procrastination, time deepens. When you fast from fear, time opens. When you fast from empty commitments, time becomes sacred. You begin to sense that time is not counting against you, it is waiting for you, waiting for your authentic self to emerge, waiting for your gifts to sharpen, waiting for your spirit to strengthen, waiting for your purpose to align. And in this alignment, abundance becomes less of a chase and more of a consequence. You no longer reach for things that do not belong to your future. You no longer cling to things that no longer belong to your identity. You no longer hunger for what cannot nourish your spirit. Because fasting has taught you discernment, the crown jewel of spiritual intelligence. Discernment is the light that reveals which doors are opportunities and which doors are traps. Discernment is the inner compass that warns you when your ego is speaking louder than your spirit. Discernment is the quiet voice that says, "This is enough," when greed tries to whisper more. Discernment is the voice of wisdom, pulling you away from shortcuts that would poison your character. Strongholds collapse the moment discernment becomes louder than desire. And as you continue fasting, fasting from lies, fasting from ego, fasting from distraction, fasting from fear, you recognize that the purpose of fasting is not the emptying, but the filling, not the deprivation, but the restoration, not the subtraction, but the revealing. You are becoming someone you have always been capable of being, someone the strongholds hoped you would never meet, someone dangerous to darkness, not because you fight it, but because you do not feed it. Someone powerful, not because you dominate others, but because you have mastered yourself. Someone whole, not because your life is perfect, but because your spirit is aligned. A person like this does not tear down strongholds through violence. They tear them down by starvation. They tear them down by clarity. They tear them down by truth. They tear them down by becoming. And now you stand in the early dawn of this becoming, feeling something vast awakening inside you, a strength so ancient it feels like memory, a clarity so pure it feels like destiny, a purpose so deep it feels like a calling long ignored but never forgotten. You begin to sense that your transformation is not an event, it is a birth, not a moment but a new way of being, not a change in behavior but a rebirth of identity, not a shift in actions but a resurrection of the soul. And everything in your life that once enslaved you feels suddenly small, suddenly powerless, suddenly distant, not because the world changed, but because you changed. And so, as the long inward journey nears its quiet horizon, you begin to feel the weight of a truth so profound that it almost humbles you to silence. Fasting did not change the world around you, it changed the world within you. And by changing the world within you, it changed everything that the world around you could no longer control. The strongholds that once towered over your mind now feel strangely distant, like ruins from a life you no longer inhabit. Their shadows no longer fall across your path. Their whispers no longer echo in your decisions. Their presence no longer shapes your identity, for you have become someone they cannot withstand. What once felt impossible now feels inevitable. What once felt heavy now feels holy. What once felt like a battle now feels like a birth. You stand now, not as someone who escaped bondage, but as someone who no longer produces the conditions where bondage can survive. You became a different atmosphere, a different vibration, a different spirit, and the strongholds that once fed on your weakness, starved in the presence of your strength, they died not by your anger, but by your refusal to feed them. They collapsed, not because you fought them directly, but because you walked into a higher truth where they could not follow. This is the quiet triumph of the transformed soul. It does not brag. It does not boast. It simply continues becoming. You begin to notice that your thoughts are cleaner, your desires are purer, your decisions are steadier, your heart is lighter. You are no longer ruled by impulses. You are guided by intention. No longer driven by fear, you are anchored by conviction. No longer shaped by old stories, you are writing new ones with every breath. This is the final gift of fasting. The space it creates becomes the sanctuary where your new life is born. A sanctuary where you finally understand wealth as something deeper than accumulation, wealth as clarity, integrity, restraint, courage, and gratitude. A sanctuary where peace is not the absence of pressure, but the presence of alignment. A sanctuary where purpose is not something you chase, but something you live. A sanctuary where the noise of the world fades into irrelevance, and the truth of who you are rises with unmistakable authority. And in this sanctuary, you meet the person you were always meant to become. The person the strongholds feared. The person your younger self prayed for. the person your future depends on. A person no longer haunted by cravings, no longer tormented by old identities, no longer shaped by illusions, no longer fractured by hidden fears. A person whole within themselves, a person awake. And as you stand in this newness, something extraordinary happens to your soul, something so subtle, yet so monumental, that words can only gesture toward it. You no longer fast to escape darkness. You fast to embody light, light that cannot be manipulated, light that cannot be bought, light that cannot be dimmed, light that cannot be intimidated, light that cannot be negotiated with, light that stands simply because standing is what truth does. And when this light fills you, the strongholds fall completely, not by the violence of your hands, but by the purity of your being. Not because you fought your demons, but because you stopped feeding them. Not because you chased holiness, but because you created space for it. Not because you conquered your weaknesses, but because you transformed into someone they could no longer inhabit. This is the quiet, irreversible victory of a soul reborn. You are no longer at war. You have outgrown the battlefield. And as you walk forward into your future, the air around you feels different, lighter, cleaner, sharper, almost sacred. Not because life will no longer challenge you, but because your spirit now stands tall enough to meet whatever comes. You carry within you a new atmosphere, one built not on fear but on wisdom, not on impulse but on intention, not on longing but on fullness. And this atmosphere moves with you wherever you go. It blesses the spaces you enter. It strengthens the people you touch. It clarifies the decisions you make. It radiates without effort, because it flows from truth, not performance. For this is the final revelation. Fasting was never about tearing down darkness. It was about revealing the strength you always carried. It was about remembering who you were before the world bruised you. It was about returning to the center the strongholds hoped you would forget. It was about becoming someone the darkness has no strategy for. And now that you have become that person, now that your inner world has aligned with the light it was designed for, the strongholds are not merely weakened, they are irrelevant. Walk forward in this truth. Walk forward in this clarity. Walk forward in this fullness. Walk forward in this new atmosphere. For the soul that has mastered the art of fasting becomes a soul that no stronghold, no shadow, no whisper of darkness can ever hold again.